And we are live. Okay, we won't do the intro. Hey, hi everyone. I'm Mike Watson here with my regular co-host, Dirt Son of Earth, and we have with us Conrad Hamilton. Conrad is well known to many of you as an admin and pretty much the main kind of mover of the Capital Comrades group on Facebook, which grew out of readings of Marx's Capital. He's also co-author of the book Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, and what is postmodern conservatism, both out with Zero Books. So Conrad recently finished his PhD thesis with Catherine Manabu, a supervisor at Paris 8, and he's here today. He's just written a manifesto called the Manifesto for a Post-Pandemic Politics, and the manifesto you can see here is on the New Centres platform. And we'll speak a little bit about the New Centre before we finish, because we both have courses coming up, myself and Conrad, there next year, early next year. So great to see you, Conrad. How are you doing?
Great to see you too. Great to see you too. Thanks for the opportunity to come on here and talk about the manifesto, which actually, and I should say first of all, like it's attributed to Aelita Collective, and I did, I'm responsible for almost all of the text, but I did give it this sort of collective name, partly because Mohammed Salami of the New Center provided a lot of good feedback, in terms of suggestions, and partly because I think that a lot of the ideas in the manifesto evolved out of kind of political discussions we were having, like in, Capital Comrades, for example. So, I didn't want to really claim individual ownership in that way.
But when you say Aelita, that's what, maybe I missed something you just said there. But I mean, how did you write it with a collective? How did that go?
Well, what I'm saying is it's not directly
okay.
collective. Yeah. What I was saying is that like it evolved out of discussions, I think, that were occurring online. And then Mohammed Salami gave a lot of feedback. So I didn't feel like, it wasn't something I was trying to assert individual ownership in such a strong way.
Okay. Because I was taking the Aelita Collective to be linked to Aelita Books, where you did your presentation recently.
Well, I just gave him, I gave him a little bit of a heads up, just a reference there. I don't know if that's good or bad for them, but yeah, I presented the books, the manifesto at Aelita Books in London. So
and they were supportive.
Yeah. I mean, we can maybe later we can talk about the reception of the manifesto.
Aelita Books is a bookshop in Lower Clapton in London, quite near where I lived when I first moved back there in my early 20s when I studied a master's. Anyway, I lived there for a while near there. It looks like a great bookshop. I haven't been back to London in years, but it's run partly by Danny Badman Massive, aka Danny Scott, who works with Doug Lane and was working with Doug Lane on Zero Books before Doug left, and that's a long story we won't go into today. But so Conrad, basically the manifesto, but I mean one thing that kind of marks it out is it being a manifesto. So it's an article. I mean it's a text. You can see it on this platform of the New Centre for Research.
Which is =ampersand.org for anyone looking for it.
Yeah, and we'll link to it anyway. I think it's linked to beneath the live video we're doing now. But basically, I mean, it's quite brave releasing a manifesto right now. There have been recent manifestos that have done quite well. I mean, in recent years, such as the Accelerationist Manifesto. But it seemed more of a treatise than a thing one would actually do. Whereas you seem more like you're literally kind of trying to push politics in a certain direction. I mean, how do you feel about that? Is this something you expect people to take up some of these ideas, or you want to influence electoral politics, or rather, I would say, influence things away from electoral politics?
Well, I mean, I think the relationship to, to electoral politics in the manifesto is actually complicated. I suppose it's definitely the case. Like if you read the manifesto, that one of the big goals, is to stress the importance of social movements, even sort of civic uprisings and these kind of things. But at no point do I suggest that parliamentary representation isn't useful. And in fact, I think I expressly sort of say the opposite. I mean, I think it's it's interesting to because obviously Lenin is drawn upon in the manifesto, and it's interesting to take an example of someone like Lenin. I mean, I'm not a Lenin scholar, but I know that he wrote a letter to sort of the German ultra left, Luxembourg and so on, and they had founded, I think, the Spartacus organization. I don't know if my timeline is going to be exactly right, but essentially they had stated that the parliamentary representation is obsolete, and he contests this thesis, right? Because we know that of course the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union were actually active, in kind of parliamentary chambers, right? So I don't think here it's a question of whether parliamentary representation is useful. I think the question posed fundamentally by the manifesto is or the thesis, so to speak, is that parliamentary representation is not useful by itself, right? That has to be connected to larger forms of, broader forms of social engagement and activism.
Yeah,
sure,
I
it's
saw
one
it
of
as
two. Sorry, Adam, you go ahead.
Well, I was very quick. I was going to say, yeah, I read it more as a warning of this is not enough, that it is an easy trap to fall into. So kind of like, yeah, simply a warning, not to say don't engage with this, but be careful when you do to not, fall into the cycle of denouncing the rest.
Yeah, I always take that like this is not enough to mean we need to be doing something quite different, and that would have to be something quite significant if we credited that thing with having the balance of power to kind of supplement electoral politics. I mean, it's putting quite a lot of responsibility on whatever that thing is that we're not currently doing enough of. And then the other claim I think that stands out in the manifesto, where I think you'd also say you're not like saying one should do this or one shouldn't do that, but there is a kind of strong claim towards a reevaluation of, shall we say, non-pacifist politics. I don't want to say you're asking us to reevaluate violence as such, and that to me kind of leaves me thinking, well, where do we then go? Because if one is not being pacifist, they're being violent.
Well, the relationship to and I think probably to call it, to say that it calls for a reevaluation of the role of violence isn't unfair. Though I would add that I don't necessarily like, even when we talk about politics, like what does violence mean, and that can be very ambiguous, right? So you see these uprisings with the Gilets jaunes in France, and they'll destroy property, and people will say, oh, this is this tremendous act of violence, whereas the police are actually the ones sort of killing people, right? So I don't think that violence is itself simple. I mean, Zizek often discusses sort of metaphysical violence, right? That's the way he speaks. So I think in terms of the position on violence, I mean, I would just want to note kind of inductively that if we look at the history of movements which have really, really transformed the world, right? Whether we're talking about the French Revolution or the Paris Commune or the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, that in different ways and it'd be very, very complex to assess all these things right now. But this is to say that these were not by any stretch of the imagination electoralist or pacifistic sort of movements, right? That's not to say that they sought to initiate violence for violence's sake, right? That's not to say that they eschewed electoral representation at every level. But I don't think, I think it's very hard to be successful, because we have to ask ourselves, even when we talk about democracy, it's like, what is democracy, right? And that's a big theme as well running through the manifesto. But I mean, in the context of something like the French Revolution, democracy is not like going to, an electoral site and filling in a ballot, right? It's like something that occurs, spontaneously and on the street, right? By people kind of rising up and, smashing things, whatever, And I think that, in the 19th century, I think that this tendency to conflate democracy with this sort of formalized process is itself part of, a certain kind of recuperation, of what transpired in the French Revolution by sort of moneyed classes throughout Europe, for example. right? So again, I think we have to be careful and kind of put all these things in their historical context. But in general, I just, a guy asked a question about this to me at Historical Materialism. He said, well, you seem to be rejecting nonviolence, and for me, it's like if you really have a plan that's plausible in terms of nonviolence, I'd be happy to pursue it. It just seems to me almost a bit futile, to when we're considering the entire history of social change and how it's actualized, right? Because I think there are clear and strong patterns. Right?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my objection to non-violence would be that we just don't have the parts in place yet. I think when violence has been used successfully by the left or by anyone to overturn a government, then they've already got influence within the army often, or they have amassed considerable arms and they have a trained kind of body of soldiers or revolutionaries. So I think we can't overestimate our appeal, and we just don't appeal to people on the level where they would be prepared to train. I think that if one is to condone non-violence, it would have to be with a view to building a movement over years, entailing everything that entails. So basically, appealing to people on the basis of community in itself, that had to be an end in itself, so people get involved. Then seeing the potential, they wish to make that move to finally take power, and if that can't be done electorally, you would have to then use violence. But I think the danger in talking about violence before you have any of that in place is that you're putting a big target on yourself just by talking about it, and then there is the risk of censure and even imprisonment, etc. So I suppose tactically, I just wonder, if we're not really far from that point.
Well, but I think in a way, it's like, when you talk about censure and the risks of it, it's like, I think, and not to downplay the fact that these are realities, but it occurs to me, when you listen to someone like Donald Trump speak, right? He's very, very, and we were talking about, when I was talking about the necessity of kind of having, a certain kind of militarization or having social movements that support you, he's very, very conscious of preserving that the support of that sort of segment of the far right. Right, to the point that he explicitly refuses to disavow groups that, by most conventional standards would be deemed to be quite extreme. Now, obviously, as I'm not a member of the far right, I find this repugnant. But I just mean to say that I think it's very, very instructive in our current political climate that a politician is capable of doing something like that, and in spite of, sort of the pervasive opinions of the punditry, not simply being, expelled from the political stage, right? And I think, it is possible to underestimate how much anger there is at this moment, particularly after COVID, right? I think there, in many respects, I think you could argue that there's a lot more anger towards the political establishment than there is aversion, right, to these more radical segments of the culture in this moment. Right. I think this, and to it's it's probably conceptualized quite vaguely in our current political landscape in terms of the this climate defined by this polarization between neoliberalism and the far right. But yes, I do think there's certainly a very, very strong and pervasive skepticism of kind of the neoliberal establishment at this time.
Oh, that's completely true. Talking to people at my job and just out and about, you see that quite a bit. So I think it depends on where you are, where you see that, what's more frowned upon, the establishment or the radical elements, left or right, But I want to say the way you talked about violence, I think we saw that a little bit in the first Sanders run, not directly, but to some of the things that he kind of alluded to. Like when pressed on certain questions, when they say, well, how would you get this done? And he responded with, well, there would be 1 million plus people in the street and they would come and say, hey, this has to be done right now. That's alluding to something more than direct parliamentary politics, right? But he, the Democratic establishment obviously took that very negatively and did push back against it. And it was sad to see Sanders retreat from those lines of thought, from a more populist, siding of the people, and go into endorsing the Democratic Party no matter what.
Well, I think even if we're living in a digital age, people still very much think in terms of feet on the ground and what that means in terms of occupying territories. So 1 million people on the streets is a big worry for a government still. I just think that we're way closer to having 1 million people on the streets. We're way closer to having 1 million people on the streets, for some kind of crackpot idea around not wearing masks and COVID and 5G, than for socialism. That's a worry. If we get into numbers and
just wait till we start pumping the socialism beams through the 5G towers, then we'll be talking. Here's Freefall Freedom says revolution only works when the military is apathetic and let the people take over. What would happen if they don't let them? I think we kind of alluded to that. Well, you don't think it's true. I think we kind of covered that in just the idea that we're not at the right moment to use violence, if that is even at all an aspiration. But Adam, you were going to say something else. Well, no, that was it. I was just going to question that the military apathetic is a strange word to use there, I think. But I wanted to direct it towards Conrad. It works
when the military are just on side, really, or if you can overwhelm them somehow, or just tactically. Hang on. All right, sorry, Conrad. I think you kind of covered it. But have you got anything else to say on that?
Yeah. I mean, what I do say when I talk about it is charting a pathway to power, particularly based on sort of the proliferation of anti-establishment sentiment. We've seen all these different uprisings over the past few years. Nuit debout in France, BLM, Gilets jaunes, and all these kind of things. And I completely agree with you, Mike, when you say we're closer to getting 1 million people on the street, protesting about some kind of weird vertigo of conspiracy, right, than any kind of bona fide leftist agenda. But that that's also why I ascribed a great deal of importance to the organization of a party in order to that's goal is to translate those sort of anti-political bromides into something like a more tangible socialist program. Now, in terms of the military, I think it poses a serious question. I think that as in a way, if we're to be clear, I'm not advocating people to go to Nepal and train in guerrilla cells and that. It's gonna, I don't think that's the kind of solution we need. I think Adam touched on it more when he was talking about 1 million people, right? Ready to go out and concretely support those things. Now, would such a movement be non-violent? In the very narrow sense that adjective is often used by the media, whereas even the Gilets jaunes are violent because they're destroying property, because they're very rambunctious and so forth. I'm skeptical of that. I think if you had 1 million people out there really angry, because they felt that someone like Sanders was being hijacked, right, by the Democratic establishment, I think that's going to be a different kind of formation. But I'm not, I'm certainly not discussing any kind of direct confrontation with military forces. As for the military in general, I mean, I do think that, you really have to look at the speed with which, the fundamental foundations of our society are sort of eroding. Right. And I think that, even if you look at, and all of this has been so accelerated, right, by the pandemic, but even if you look at automation, it's in a few years, we're going to have self-driving cars, right? It's being a truck driver is the biggest profession in America. There's 4 or 5 million people who do that. So when you put those people out of work and we don't have another solution, right? I think it was actually Andrew Yang who pointed this out. It's how hard is it, for someone to just kind of take a truck and park it on a major highway, right? We're really not far from those kind of disruptions. So, you know, I'm not saying that, you know, the U.S. military is going to, you know, capitulate, you know, in the face of a popular movement that we assemble like tomorrow, right? You know, but it's also important to remember that you know, whatever their sort of reactionary alignment, a lot of members of the U.S. military come from the working class, right, or sub-proletariat sort of class, disproportionately African American and so forth. You know, and I do think in light of the, you know, particular suffering experienced by those communities and the particular suffering that those communities are eligible to experience in the near future, right? You know, because of this, you know, sort of meltdown of our system that we've been seeing since 2007, 2008, but which has accelerated more recently. You know, I think there can potentially be, you know, even in that context, a susceptibility to a change in political authority, if not tomorrow, in the longer term period.
For sure, yeah. You do talk about other things actually as well. Before we get caught too much on the issue of violence, talk about you actually touch on a couple of things which really kind of bring Karl Marx to the fore, and particularly Capital. And I don't think you actually mention Marx explicitly, do you? Or not very much. You mention more Agamben, but I think the kind of, you know, the thing that interested me is the way you point towards a bigger study, because you basically point out how the coronavirus exposed some of the hypocrisies of capitalism and exposed basically some of the fundamental workings of capitalism, but also the role of the state, particularly now in shoring up capitalism. So perhaps, you know, in some senses, the window for Marxist revolution has gone. But the bit that really interested me was where you talk about, you know, the pandemic being seen as a time where the state kind of stepped in as, you literally say, protectorate of the people at large. But then you say its discriminant character must be relentlessly disseminated and exposed. So, you know, where democratic capitalism stepped in and protected the people, we need to consider its discriminant character, because there was something, you know, quite sinister about the way certain communities, I suppose, were exposed to COVID more than others, or certain demographics. I'm not sure that's exactly what you were saying at that point, but that's what it made me think of. So if we could kind of tap in to some of what went on and is ongoing with the virus and the lockdowns, etc., we could maybe kind of make some of Marx's formulations more explicit to the public. I think you know, the way in which there were certain equations, or, you know, there are ongoing equations as to how many people we can let die, and how much do we actually just need them to go to work to make profit. You know, that is very cynical, and that is talked about. Obviously not that, but, you know, the way in which people are expendable and have like a certain amount of value that can be extracted from them as labor value before they can then, you know, die. You know, that's something that Marx talks about, you know, in terms of literally, we know that we have working processes that can kill people, you know, through illness at quite an early age, or can, you know, often kind of randomly end up killing people, thinking maybe of mining processes and other kind of extraction processes. But, you know, that being kind of okay as long as we kind of balance the books properly, you know, and that seems to be what's gone on with, you know, with people having to work in, for example, food factories or on construction sites, but obviously people have to get quite close together. Anyway, so you know, the point that interests me is, and my question is, how do we get that to the public? You know, how do we kind of convey to the public, this is what's happening? There are basically equations being conducted that affect whether you can live or die, etc. I mean, when I say that, I mean, how do we get to the public? Not just that, because that's just kind of macabre, but how do we get to the public in such a way that we can present Marxism as something somehow useful?
Yeah, well, I think people feel these things. You know, I mean, people have been tremendously impacted by this. I mean, since, you know, I understand that essentially, like, the billionaire class since the outset of the pandemic have acquired about $3 trillion, whereas, you know, the American working class has lost about $3 trillion. And I don't think that, while it may not be one for one, I don't think that those things are unrelated, right? So, you know, if you look at the actions of the state, I mean, I think that in terms of, you know, not being there attempting to, create something like universal basic income at this time, I think, which would be tremendously logical, or to impose a capital tax or something like that to attempt to reverse this sort of trajectory, I think you have to say that there's a kind of complicity, right, with the deepening of the class divide that we see right now. One thing that's very, very important in terms of disseminating these kind of messages is that while I am critical of, what I refer to, a little bit facetiously as the authentic left, talking about Sanders and Corbyn and Syriza and so forth, I don't totally reject those movements, right? And I think that can be eligible to misinterpretation in terms of people reading the text. It occurs to me, like, if you look at, the really quite radical movements which emerged in the 20th centuries, far left movements, for example, very often they were kind of coming out of these more sort of parliamentarian or reformist sort of structures, right? I'm thinking about, the Chinese communists coming to the nationalists in China, the relationship of the Bolsheviks to the Mensheviks and this kind of thing, right? So I think actually, even if, and I don't know exactly your views on this, but even if we could conclude at this point, because we've seen, Mélenchon has had all his support sucked out in France, Corbyn fell as Labour leader, was replaced by Starmer, Sanders, just remarkable consolidation of the Democratic establishment against him, right, in the last Democratic primary. I don't think anyone has ever dropped out prior to Super Tuesday with the same level of support Pete Buttigieg did prior to that. So even if you can conclude that there's a kind of failure that these movements have experienced, a failure that, if you were going to, we'd go further, but I would probably attribute to, Chantal Mouffe by way of Gramsci or something. We have to get into that. But, I think that they've actually created a scaffolding that's really, really valuable, right? So, and I'm thinking here of something like, for all my, and I criticize Jacobin, plenty, right, in terms of their positions. But I do have to say, I mean, it's like, if you look at a magazine like Jacobin, I understand that that has a subscription base of 75,000, right? Like, as a magazine, it's like, The Guardian, okay, and this isn't proportional in terms of its global influence, but The Guardian has a subscription base of like 110,000, right? It's like, that is like a huge, right? Like, that's a huge media voice. So I think that, honing in on this kind of message, right? And to be fair, I think, to a large extent, this is already being done to some degree. But I think honing in on that message, and not just honing in on that message regarding the discriminant character of the pandemic, and we know who's been, the most negatively affected. I guess I talk about, single mothers, Black communities, members of the subproletariat, and often, obviously, these are sort of overlapping. Not just honing in on that message, but also propounding, a sort of more muscular organizational alternative, right, to our current populist left, I think could be very, very valuable. But I want to stress that I think whatever happens now, it's kind of evolving out of, right, this sort of, because, the reality is that there's something like, there are real limitations to it, but we have created something like a mass movement, right? Now, maybe it's not mass enough, right? I point out very clearly in the manifesto, like, we have to acknowledge that, I think on the whole, we still remain too urban and too disproportionately connected with sort of the ethos of the professional class, right? But it is a movement, right? So I think what happens has to expand from that.
I think so. I mean, there are reasons to be positive, but I think, you also identify this kind of huge increase in the amount of educated people, people who go to university and who don't, but people who, have read stuff and maybe want to question things. And you see that as not entirely positive, if I recall. So let me try and recall why it is you see that as not entirely positive. So we're basically left with a sea of intellectuals who can't reach the proletariat. This is the intellectualization, basically, of the problems we face politically. And then you end up, I guess, with those people migrating into movements. So the Sanders movement was perhaps a bit removed from the mass, as was the Corbyn movement. In fact, when Corbyn was running in the 2019 election, it really looked like he might win to a number of us involved in the campaign. I was involved online in the campaign. And, online we had these forums kind of, for the campaigners, and we were talking about what was going on. And we had reason to be positive because I guess we were all talking to each other. and that shows how far removed we were from the public. So how do you see that being resolved? But also, in terms of talking about there being something of a left movement in the UK and America in a way there hasn't been for decades, i.e. people who literally call themselves socialist or sometimes democratic socialists, not going as far as socialist, but still kind of impressive. Despite there being that, there does feel that, to me particularly, maybe because I'm online so much, that many of us are just doing this kind of thing all the time. And this came up the other day with This Is Revolution. I was talking to them on their podcast, and I think it was Jason there said, well, aren't we just spending all our time projecting, the same kind of feelings onto one another, or we're basically in a bubble. What do you think about that? How are we going to get out of this bubble? I mean, is the online left not the new academic class that talks about Marx but does nothing in reality?
Yeah. I mean, I think actually there's a few different things like to touch on in your question that are really, really important. The first one has to do with like the the nature of intellectualism in our time. And I think, there's a certain kind of ambivalence in terms of how it's characterized in the manifesto, because I say like, look, on one hand, there are certain advantages, right? Education is not as exclusive in terms of its availability as it used to be in the past. At the same time, there's been an erosion of links, between, the working class and intellectuals, which I also attribute to sort of decades of Cold War propaganda, and an erosion of the working class itself. But I find it really, really striking, like this question about education, because it's like, I've read that basically the demographic most, and you can frame this in different ways, but by some accounts, the demographic most susceptible to vaccine skepticism, right, is like, basically young people who grew up in highly capitalist societies, right? Which I find interesting because that also happens to be the most educated generation in the history of humankind, right? Like, so here we're in like a totally different place than, because I still think there's sort of a conventional tendency, and I don't know, like maybe it's, if you narrow in a little bit more, maybe you'd find that a lot of the people who espouse beliefs, the most likely people to espouse beliefs and conspiracy theories are a little bit formally educated, but not too much. You could, but like in a general way, right? This is like a very, very educated demographic compared to what we see in history, right? And I think that's interesting because it's like, what I think we're seeing is that, the presence of formal education, isn't enough to, dissuade people from espousing belief in, these kind of conspiracy theories and so forth. So I think there's something that happens, and it relates in our society, I think, to, there's this pervasive skepticism about sort of the establishment, right? But it ends up being, for lack of a critique of capital, let's say, as good Marxists, we would say, okay, there should be a critique of capital. It ends up being articulated in this very, very generalized and I think sort of dangerous way, right? And you see how easily this can sort of, project onto potentially, xenophobic theses, right? The Chinese have 5G, they're trying to invade our brains, right? And this kind of thing. But I think it's a larger cognitive crisis that's also connected to the way we experience the internet, right? And I think that, within digital capitalism, right? If you think of like in the past, right? It's like, to be educated was in a sense to be, conscious of sort of the opinions of the authorities of knowledge, right? So, like people would read, mostly like newspapers, like the same kind of journalists, they go to schools, right? And there were texts that were sort of officially sanctioned, right? That informed your worldview. But I think in the age of the internet, like it's quite different. And I think there's a tremendous plurality of different views that are available, but I don't think as a society, we've really reached a point where we have the actual maturity intellectually to navigate that, right? And I don't think that, so I think on one hand, you have this great skepticism about the way that our system functions. And on the other, I think you have like a crisis of cognitive mapping that's just seeing people kind of grab on, right, to these different kind of theories, which are sort of readily available to them, right? But I also think in a way, you know, it may be the case, again, that younger people are more educated, but I also think that their exposure to this tremendously relativizing vertigo in terms of the internet and how we experience it can potentially make them more susceptible to conspiratorial ideas. That is to say that I think in one form or another, I think that people who are older, they may be less educated, but I think, you know, they're more conditioned to defer to certain established authorities in terms of, you know, how they articulate themselves politically. Right?
Oh yeah, yeah. In fact, like, so they're not only more prone to maybe think conspiratorially, they're more exposed to conspiracy itself, like all the time, right? Like my generation, I'm 33, grew up with the History Channel showing us ancient aliens and, you know, Hitler on the moon and stuff like that. So that's like this ingrained skepticism that almost pushes you to look for the alternative opinion, you know, and like the alternative of the alternative, which doesn't really teach critical reasoning or thinking like that. You know, it teaches to eschew the status quo, but, you know, not in a necessarily meaningful way. I think though, Mike, I was actually thinking about this because I watched you on This Is Revolution, the stream, and I think y'all are onto something about you know, the online left or whatever being somewhat akin to the academic left of yesteryear. I think one of the potential differences that I think is helpful for the online left, podcasters and memesters or whatever, is that theoretically we're more in dialogue with the working class. Now, obviously not always, and the internet creates these filter bubbles and niche communities, and we can find ourselves in little enclaves thinking we're really doing something, but we are technically accessible to everyone, and we're trying to have that dialogue where, you know, academia in the 70s, 80s, 90s was not trying to do that very much. Not in the forefront, you know, on the outskirts, maybe a little bit. I do think that's an important aspect that the online left could seize upon.
Can I just
I think so. Yeah, go on, Conrad. Yeah.
I just want to say, I'd be careful though about, like, I agree with you in principle in terms of these mediums function, but I would be careful about lumping together the 70s, 80s, and 90s, or generalizing too much with respect to the cultures we're talking about. Because, like, if you look at a place like France, right, you know, in the 60s, right, you know, you have 500,000 members, I think, of the French Communist Party, right? You know, and so if you look at a philosopher like Louis Althusser, right, who was at the most prestigious, sort of illustrious educational institutions in the country, which were controlled by the Communist Party, by the way, the UNS, the Sorbonne. You know, he when he writes philosophy, he's writing as a member of the French Communist Party, which is, you know, in which there are a lot of working class people, a lot of powerful unions like the CGT, and so forth. And you know, we could talk about Italy and all the links there. Mike might be more familiar with that too. But the point is that, like, you know, if we're talking about, you know, someone in like an Anglophone context in like the 80s or something, you know, even the 70s, in which, like, you know, these movements are not as powerful as they may have been in places like Italy and France, I would probably concur with your sentiment. But the bottom line regarding, you know, the online left now, as I said, we're still overly beholden to a sort of professional segment of the population to a far greater degree than what you would have found, you know, certainly in any country with like a robust socialist movement, you know, in the aftermath of World War II. So I would just add that.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think
that's if I can add something, actually, because I think in the conversation on This Is Revolution the other day, somebody did say, I think it was Jason, said that actually a lot of activists really are hesitant to come on to podcasts and streams and whatnot because their fellow activists kind of, you know, they kind of like insult them for it, basically. And I've seen this actually with an activist in the UK used to say before he could come on our podcast, he had to talk to the group he was working with. There was a housing movement and the Revolutionary Communist Party, because they were very kind of particular about, you know, where people went to speak and people speaking for the group rather than for themselves. So there is that kind of issue of, I mean, I think, the online left, it very much lends itself to personalities. So you're speaking for yourself, whereas if somebody's part of an activist movement, they should be speaking for the movement. So they have to go through processes before they can even go on and talk about what they're doing with that movement. So I think there is this gap still of people that maybe see the online left a bit like they see the art world, because I know that a lot of activists are very standoffish with the art world because they see like political art as being, you know, making art about politics without doing the actual politics. So it enables people to get the credibility for talking about politics without really being politically very useful or putting themselves in any sense out there, taking any risks. So I mean, there are those kind of provisos. I mean, I'd say, okay, we're speaking to more working class people in some senses, yeah, but how are we speaking to them? Because we're speaking to them often, you know, like this, like they're out there somewhere. I mean, I'd say I'm fairly working class in my background. I don't know, but I mean, I'm not talking. I mean, I'm not. You know, I'm a freelancer, proofreading and writing stuff, and occasionally doing visiting lecturers. I have been an adjunct, but you know, I'm not in a position of somebody who is working as a nurse or, you know, working on a quarry or factory. So, you know, I'm not really going and talking to people who might really, you know, have an investment in there being a revolution, but don't really know, you know, they don't really understand Marx. So they've always thought that socialism is something bad. So, you know, how are we going to get out there and talk to those people? It seems that we're not really. And actually, Conrad was just making reference to, I think he was making reference to operaismo, excuse my, I can't never do that R sound in Italian, but the workerism movement in Italy in the 60s. And, you know, basically this movement, the workerist movement, used to go and work very much with workers. So you had artists, activists going and talking to people in factories. And you had a similar thing actually in Germany. And interestingly, the student who was the head of the movement, which Adorno called the police on, because Theodor Adorno from the Frankfurt School actually called the police on his own students during some uprisings in the late 1960s, 1969. The head guy, Hans-Jürgen Krahl, was actually writing on workerism, was very linked in with the workerist movement in Italy. And actually, had he not died quite young, not long after Adorno died, Krahl may have taken over the Frankfurt School, which means history would have been completely different. He would have been maybe one of the likely next directors, because he was actually one of Adorno's PhD students, and had a lot of people amassed around him when he had this student movement. And then Adorno died that year, and then Krahl became very popular, and you know, eyes were on him, so he may have became the director of the institute instead of who was it who took over Habermas?
Yeah, I think so.
But there was, excuse me for fluffing that a bit, but there was, what I mean to say, if I can get there, is there was a strong movement which entailed going and talking to workers and doing all this stuff, you know, with workers. And it's not happening now. I'm not sure how much we're really getting through to workers. I think we might overrate how much we're getting to the working classes.
Well, I guess that brings me to a question is, does anyone know of, you know, some kind of online left space that is actively doing that, that's, you know, interviewing workers about the material conditions
interviewing
of their,
I don't know, but I mean,
talking
I think
to, not interviewing.
a point was made as well on This is Revolution, and it's a point actually I've made, is that I don't know how many people are actually doing stuff. Like, I know I'm involved with the local left party. I don't know what other people do, and maybe like all of us are doing stuff. Maybe many of us are actually somehow politically involved. So actually, you know, in a sense, it's like, I don't want to like labour the point too much, because probably people who are doing left things online are, you know, a certain amount of them are also doing stuff, you know, in reality. But sorry, I don't know how that answered your point.
Well, I think I think maybe that it could be a good route to go down, or
to actually talk to workers and things. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
think people really do. Yeah, I don't know how you'd keep the audience, because we had on, and he's not a worker really, he's a school teacher. We had on that guy, Andrew Cooper. I think I had him on once on Theory Wave Nights, the channel I used to run. And then we had him once on Acid Communism. And he's like a really knowledgeable expert on Capital, Marxist Capital. He's been reading it for years. And he talks really well. I mean, he's got a very working class accent. But people weren't really watching him and engaging with him. He's not cool in the way. I mean, I don't think he'll mind me saying that, but he's not cool in the way people want me to be, or in the way people are supposed to be, you know, on the online left. There's a broad kind of
To
aesthetic.
be a cult of the influencer.
It's like ways that are kind of in and ways that aren't in. I mean, there's a certain language we don't realize we're probably even engaging in, but we are kind of visually and in the way we speak.
Right, right.
Yeah, well, I don't think. Can I just, if I can just interject?
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think, you know, it's actually a really, really delicate issue. You know, I mean, I was talking about operaism, sure. I was also talking about, you know, even in a more general capacity, the history of the Italian Communist Party, which, you know, their drift into professionalization was what workerism was trying to offset, right? And, you know, and this kind of fails, and then you have kind of Postoperative, which is sort of about kind of phantasmically kind of attributing this revolutionary capacity to you know, groups in the population, which, you know, never turn out to actually be able to achieve the changes that you want them to, right? So it kind of, you know, eventually it becomes almost like a kind of discourse of finance speculation or something. It's like, you know, who's the new working class? You know? Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, one has to be a little bit, you know, and none of that's wrong. And it's very clear that we have to expand our support, you know, amongst the working class. One thing I think that's very, very important to doing, to achieving that is, you know, embracing people's frustrations with the system, you know, channeling them, but embracing them, right? You know, and I talk a little bit about that in the manifesto. You know, when we saw like the Capitol Hill attacks, and people were like, that's wrong because it's an attack, right? And it's like, well, I think it's wrong because there's repulsive ideological content. I don't think it's wrong because it's an attack, you know? Or the way now that with like the Sanders movement, for example, the decision, and I was very, very opposed to this. I wrote an article, I was arguing with Matt McManus and Ben Burgess about this, but the decision of Sanders, you know, to endorse Biden, right? You know, and really for nothing. I mean, they got nothing back, right? You know, and you know, people like AOC kind of taking this line, put these people in a very compromised position whereby now they're being attacked by sort of, you know, the left flank of their own movement, and they're attacking back, and they're spending a lot of time attacking, you know, their own kind of far left activistic base, right? You know, and again, I think that's kind of the problem, right? Like, I think that these things should not be happening. I mean, it's already enough of a liability for someone like Sanders to style himself as a Democrat, given the tremendous popular ambivalence towards a party like that. But I think that when you go in the direction of complicity with its establishment, you know, I think there's a really, really deep alienation with the kinds of demographics, you know. Well, and look, we saw in the primary with Sanders, right? Like, it was Jim Clyburn, right? You know, black communities in places like South Carolina, right, that really turned the tide against Sanders. So it just shows you, you know, the failure to make inroads amongst these more marginalized demographics. So all that's true, but I also think that we have to be, you know, I think, you know, even if it's the case that we don't have sort of adequate representation, I think that one has to be able to, because sometimes I think on the left we have a tendency to kind of fetishize, you know, this idea that, you know, and of course workerism itself is guilty of it in some way, but this idea that sort of working people always know the way, right? You know, and I think that's actually interesting. I discussed this like in terms of Lenin, right? You know, and Lenin points out, he says like, look, he's like, there's a latent capacity within these sort of industrial movements in Russia, for example, to support, you know, a revolutionary kind of government. But he also underlines the way that sort of what he calls trade union consciousness, like the inadequacy of that to reach, you know, to realize by itself a sort of broader, more Marxist worldview, right? And so this puts like, you know, Lenin, you know, it's quite sort of paradoxical and kind of poetic as a formulation. But, you know, in the manifesto, I quote it where Lenin says like, well, you know, it may be true that there's a sort of spontaneous impulse amongst the workers that gravitates towards socialism. The problem is that, you know, bourgeois ideology is always weighing even more strongly on the other side, right? And Lenin says very clearly, like, we need, you know, because it was the intelligentsia that introduced Marxism to Russia, right? Lenin was very clear about the role of intellectuals, right? You know, even who don't come from that kind of class background within the party. So again, I don't think it's bad to have more advanced theoretical discourses. I think it's important to also, you know, and we see that we're kind of, you talk about, I don't think that the communication is so much the problem in that way. I mean, there are papers like Jacobin that create like highly digestible, sort of think pieces or news commentaries. I think the problem has more to do with the fundamental political orientation of the populist left and the decisions they've made, right? And I think that's going to be turning off, a lot of working people. But in terms of having this kind of mix, which to some extent we already do have, right? We have highbrow leftist publications. You can pick up HM and read an essay by Alberto Toscano or something like that. We have podcasts like this, right? We have magazines like Jacobin. I think there is a good range, and I think that there's certainly a place for theoretical discourse. I think it's indispensable. But I think all that, that sort of diversity in terms of communication will all be for naught if the fundamental political positions are not correct, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of stuff that we've covered kind of throughout, over the last year and a half or so gets into that, from, of course, like Mark Fisher to Althusser, most recently Herbert Marcuse. I think in Essay on Liberation, which we read recently, he talks about, because capitalism has gotten so advanced and has provided, a certain level of comfort for some people within the world, that workers themselves today, and of course he's talking about in the late 60s, have a vested interest somewhat within the status quo themselves. So they may not opt for or go towards the more revolutionary ideals, because it does present a moment of, of scariness, a moment of break with the status quo, with the old order, leaves you in uncertainty. And as people, we want certainty, we want comfort. So if we've already secured a certain level of comfort for ourselves, we may not be willing to push the envelope and risk it in order to get a better world for everybody.
But keep in mind that like this stuff by Marcuse is not written in 2021. And I think
no. I think it's changed a bit since then, but I think of course. And not all.
Where is there like what we traditionally term like the working class? I mean, it doesn't. Probably 1/3 of people like that, go into the professional managerial class. Particularly the more educated segments of the working class, like Jewish and so forth, right? And then probably 2/3 just sort of become the subproletariat. Right, which is really manifest, even in musical cultures, like the way rock gives way to this, sort of, kind of hipster music contra, hip hop, which is more dominant, which is really the music of the subproletariat, right? So there isn't, you don't have that, that sort of anchor there that there once was, right? And it's for that reason, I think, sort of the collapse of Fordism, the collapse of this sort of dirigist model, which previously existed, which has been attacked relentlessly, since the neoliberal revolution, right? Which I guess we can trace in its earliest incarnation to Pinochet, right, in Chile in '73. The attacks on that class and the diminution of that class, I think, has led to a situation where, and like you could say, well, yeah, okay, it hasn't congealed into like, it's like Marxist revolution. Okay, I mean that's something different than just economic conditions in society. But I do think it's important. It's significant in the sense, like, even if you look at these movements in the past few years, like I'm thinking about, like, a few years ago in Minneapolis when George Floyd was killed, and the protesters, they destroyed like a police station, and they did like a study, and like 65% of Americans, right, were like, yeah, it was justified to destroy that police station. And I think you're seeing, like, even with these anti-policing movements, which are limited and problematic in their own ways, but even with these kind of anti-policing movements, I think that what you're seeing is that if the function of police is to protect private property, if you're not a homeowner, right, if you don't have any money in the bank, right, there's an alienation from those institutions, which is probably different than what would have been experienced in an earlier period, right? Post World War II, for example, where people, did have those things, right? You become on the side of the people that the police are as I said, in terms of entering the subproletariat, you enter into the social class the police are attacking, right, in order to defend the rights of property, and the rights of property, are relevant to a smaller and smaller percentage of the population in that way, right? So even if this hasn't, congealed into, I certainly think you can see the latent capacities in our society, right? To build a more muscular left, based on the sort of forms of economic disaffectation which exist, which have all been intensified so much by COVID, right?
Right. Lotario, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, says that, what degree can the threat of climate change convince the world's working class that capitalism / the status quo is no longer in their advantage? And they continue, because I feel like any rise of the left in the future should probably be centered around climate change. I think you touch on this in the manifesto, linking, the link between the pandemic and climate change. But I also think there's a deeper link in there when it comes to the question of the state. One of your parts is about the schism on the state itself, and this anti-state movement amongst the left and others, of course, but how that writes off the possibilities of the state, of the good things the state could accomplish. And I think, the pandemic highlights the need for certain state functions, and I think climate change, like truly fighting it and reversing or living with the consequences that are coming, absolutely highlights that. So if you want to talk on your views on the state a little bit.
Yeah, so first I'll just go to the question about climate change. This is like a tremendously complex and important question. So I think that one thing about the current climate situation. Now, I'm a little bit in the manifesto, I make passing reference to the possibility that COVID actually, in terms of biological spillover and things like this, is connected to climate change in some way. The theories are always shifting, so I don't want to commit too much, right, to any particular angle on that. But
real fast, I think just the simple human interaction with animal species, like continuing, is a long accepted theory of why new diseases can emerge and stuff. I don't think that's controversial.
Even if we were to discover that like COVID came from a lab or something, it wouldn't change the liabilities related to public health, which are connected to climate change and so forth. Like when you have bats from a certain forest, right, that are going to another one, and this kind of ecosystems which are being upset, right? I think that it's tremendously important to organize around these issues. I think in a sense, like the problem we're facing with climate change right now is that, I think on a structural level, it's very, very hard for capitalism, and particularly, the relatively unfettered form of neoliberal capitalism, which has become, ubiquitous in recent years, to really address this. There's a lot of efforts by various green parties and everything, to propose some kind of market-based fix for these sort of environmental issues. But it's not lost on me that, and certainly if you read the work of Jason Moore or something like that, it's not lost on me that I think that because capitalism has always been based on, not just value, like we're paying for, we're paying for labor, and there's you can interpret this in different ways, but there's a disproportion between the value that's being created and the value we're paying for, right? Not just that, but also the ability to freely appropriate use values from nature, right, is really, really crucial, right, to understanding like the history of capital, right? So that's sort of simply treated as an externality, right, a kind of passivized externality. And I think were you to try to assign like a tangible value to all these things, right, somehow commensurable to their perceived import for humans or something like that, right, which is, in a way, like that's what even like a carbon tax is on some level. But if you were to really do that, right, and to realistically estimate, right, so far as you could within our current system of accounting, what that cost would be, I don't think capitalism would be able to continue functioning any more than it would be able to continue functioning if all women had to be remunerated for socially reproductive labor or something like that. These are externalities which are really, really crucial to the functioning of the system. So I think it would be important, like, if you look at global states, I mean, obviously lots of problems, but, China has been way more proactive than the United States. In the United States, I mean, politically, climate denialism is still, very, very powerful in the form of the Republican Party, and petrol lobbies and all this. China's committed to much more significant targets. They've invested a lot more money in transitioning infrastructure and all that. And I don't think that's unrelated to the fact that, whether one wishes to term China capitalist or not, and perhaps they could justly do that, it's certainly not the sort of neoliberal capitalism we have in the West, right? It's Dirigisist at least, which is actually what the UN said, right? They said, like, look, if we're going to, there was a UN report on this, I forget the report, but they basically said, look, if we're going to combat climate change, neoliberalism has to end, essentially, right? So there has to be really, really significant forms of state involvement in the economy, right? Now, a Marxist might conclude, well, that's not enough, right? But the point is, we could say at least a state like China sort of meets that criteria. So I think we're at a point where, I don't think neoliberal capitalism is able to address these issues. Structurally, I don't think it's able to. In terms of organizing, I think it's interesting. I was talking to my mom the other day. I have a lot of conversations with my mom, helps inform my worldview. She was talking about how she was in British Columbia, and they had the heaviest rain they had in like 20 years, and the roads were so muddy, she couldn't even, they were blocked, and they had to like hide out in this cabin. And she was talking about how, even as someone obviously relatively sheltered from these developments, we know that, the greatest risk, tsunamis in the third world and things like this, right? Places that don't have the resources to deal with this. Even as someone relatively sheltered from these kind of things, the impact of it is becoming more apparent to her. Obviously, if COVID turns out to have been a consequence of climate change, that's going to be a form of visibility, right? That those issues will acquire. I think in a way, there's a limit to what we can do with climate-based issues, insofar as, particularly in the West, there's a slightly longer-term trajectory we're discussing, even if it's not so long-term right now. But I think in conjunction with other issues, it can be a very, very powerful thing to invoke. And I think it's very interesting right now, because we see right now in the climate movement, we see that in a way, just as I'm saying in this manifesto, well, we have to have a stronger stance. I think we're seeing a radicalization of segments of the climate movement. I mean, I know in Andreas Malm's new book, he was talking about an article that was published in like the Atlantic or something like that, and the article was basically saying, like, how do you take climate activists seriously when like they're not willing to actually do anything violent, right, to advance their views, right? And violent, not like, okay, necessarily I'm going to kill someone or something, but like, sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Not necessarily, going to kill someone or something, but the article pointed out that, even if you took like your car keys and every time you saw like a gas guzzling sort of SUV or like a Hummer, you just scratch the paint on it, that would very quickly make, owning these kind of vehicles less plausible, right? So these are just very, very basic things. I noticed the other day there was an interview with or a press conference or something with David Suzuki, who I always imagine, growing up in Canada as this sort of very sort of pacifistic, kind of humane guy. I was seeing this. Apparently, there was a press conference or an interview with David Suzuki, and he was like, "Oh, if people don't do something with pipelines, they're going to be getting blown up by people." Right. So again, I think you're seeing that there's a reevaluation of the kind of tactics that have been used by environmentalists, and I think there's certainly an opportunity. Well, I think that we have to have a more broad-based approach. I think there's certainly an opportunity to unite that message with the kind of message I'm advocating for in the manifesto.
Okay, I just wanted to come in there. Great points, but I want to just give you a chance to say something here, because I know you talk mostly about Agamben, who I'm not that familiar with. In my time in Italy, obviously Agamben came up quite a lot, but I mean, he came up in newspapers and things, and he's written some articles recently about COVID, etc. But I'm not familiar with his wider theory. And you mentioned him and Carl Schmitt, and I believe Schmitt comes into Agamben's work, if I understood that correctly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned that Schmitt he was a Nazi, was he not, or something like
Yeah,
this?
jurist,
And then you say that, having been a Nazi, okay, you kind of like, you kind of excuse yourself for that. But of course, things being what they are, and the propensity of people to jump on you for all kinds of reasons on the internet, I want to give you a chance to just say what was his role or his link to Nazism, and why are you using those two theorists more particularly?
Well, you say using those two theorists. I mean, the critique of, like, in Agamben, it's a few paragraphs and it's a critique of Agamben. So I'm not really
sure. Okay, sure.
Yeah, I'm not really using Agamben in any way. In terms of Agamben is critiqued in the manifesto for what I take to be, and I can't go through the minutiae of Agamben's oeuvre at this moment. But he's critiqued in the manifesto for what I take to be a tendency to, and it's actually very influenced by an essay by Joshua Mafawad Paul, and what is the name of that? Just let me pull up the name. It was very influenced because he wrote an essay before sort of all of this. Sorry, I'm just getting the name. Here it is. It's called The Transplanting of Heaven to Earth Below. So I encourage people to look that up. Joshua Mafawad Paul, The Transplanting of Heaven to Earth Below, which was an influence on the manifesto, more than I perhaps do justice to, since it's not a cited, it's not a cited essay, right? I do reference his name. And the critique of Agamben there is that he sort of conceptualizes sovereignty in this very ahistorical way, right? So sovereignty is sort of this sort of malevolent and coercive force, and the problem is, when we attempt to oppose sovereignty, we invariably become complicit, right, with sovereign structures, right? So he sort of looks to someone like Bartleby the Scrivener, right? How can we, refuse authority? Not even so much. It's not even really a refusal. It's like a de facto refusal, right? I would prefer not to, right? It's not even so explicit, right, in terms of the articulation, right? That's what he likes about Bartleby. But I think one of the obvious problems with this is it's like, it has the effect of lumping together very, very diverse kinds of state formations in terms of history. So yes, like I would concur with Lenin that wherever there's the state, you're going to find class difference, right? States and class differences are historically synonymous, but that's not to say that all states are the same, right? I think there's a big difference between anti-capitalist states, forms of indigenous sovereignty, and like the United States of America or like Nazi Germany or something like that. These are different things, right? And the other question that really has to be raised about this kind of anti-statism, which is really, really crucial in terms of understanding his position on COVID, right? Because as many people probably know, Agamben has been accused of channeling sort of COVID conspiracism, right? And probably is the most notable philosophical representative of that kind of thinking. I think the other issue here, which would be sort of a Leninist critique, the other issue would be like, well, what are you going to do without the state, right? Yes, the state may attest to class difference, right? But in a world in which there are capitalist states with limitless capacity for martial violence, right? Like, how can you resist that without using that formation yourself, albeit in a reconfigured way, right? So there are lots of perils with that, but that's a very central thread of argumentation, within the manifesto. Now, on the other side, you're talking about Schmitt, right? So Schmitt would be significant to Agamben. Though Agamben has an anti-statist bent, which Schmitt does not. Though it's interesting that, both Agamben and Schmitt sort of treat the state in this very, very ahistorical way, right? They don't tend to discuss, as a Marxist would want to, I think, differences in kind of modes of production and these kind of things. It's like the state is treated quite abstractly, right? What I like about, for all his shortcomings, what I like about Schmitt is the way that he understands that there's always something which is unnegotiable at the core of the state, right? There's always an absolute element, right? that you cannot change, right? Simply through some kind of parliamentary engagement or whatever. And it's not that element, by the way, doesn't I wouldn't think of that as having to be bad, right? I think having this sort of hard authoritarian element isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? You wouldn't want to reify it too much, but in some cases you're going to need that. You're going to profit from that. But I think what that can tell us in our current situation is just the fact that you can't it's not that it would be impossible to make a country like the United States socialist, but that would necessarily entail a confrontation with sovereign power that something like an electoral system is not capable of generating. Right? An electoral system is built around that. It's not built to cut through that and engage with that. So, an electoralist program could be helpful in bringing about those changes, but it's never going to be adequate to actually transform that. Now, there's some other authors who've made good use of Schmitt. I mean, I really enjoyed the text by Derrida, Rogues or Voyou, right? And he wrote that. It was actually, I think it was Derrida's last book, right? And in that text, Derrida, of course, was Sephardic Jewish, Francophone, grew up in Algiers, later left Algiers, during the Algerian War, right? He's kind of interested in his story in the media, because in Algeria in the 90s, and again, I can't, elaborate all the political details, but in Algeria in the 90s, they attempted to have a democratic election, but the party that was going to win was sort of like an Islamic dictatorial party. So the government canceled the election in order to preserve democracy, so to speak, right? And Derrida, has a lot of fun with this kind of paradox, right, in the book. But of course we know, and this is what I bring up in the manifesto as well, we know that democracy, how does American democracy, whatever its limitations at that time, or even today, how does it begin, right? And it begins with, do you support democracy or not? Okay, if you don't, then get out. We're going to violently expel you. Because you have to create a people, right, that are going to support democracy. That's your first step, right? How does French republicanism and this sort of democratic spirit, how does that commence? I mean, this is also something that's violent. So again, I think it's possible. Like, you see these weird paradoxes, like you'll see people online, they'll be like, they'll be like, destroying properties un-American, and someone will be like, but what about like the Boston Tea Party? Like, that's literally how that starts, right? Like, so I think it's very easy from the standpoint of the present to be ahistorical and imagine that, like, well, we just kind of joined hands and sung kumbaya, and in China they're bad, they're dictatorial, right? And whatever badness may exist in China, I think it's very important to remember that these were forceful and violent constitutions of these structures that were necessary to arrive at a society that could make something like electoral democracy part of its sort of core state character, right? Or part of its fundamental sovereignty.
And
I think that they are sorry, Adam. I mean, states, nation states, governments, etc. They're kind of declarations that are backed up with force. Definitely, yeah. They're a lot like art statements that are backed up by galleries and museums and art critics and curators and whatnot. And that's something that actually makes them very powerful, contrary to saying, well, there's nothing really there. I mean, how does one shift that belief in the state? Or that the state should be run by certain people? You would have to educate people en masse anyway to get them to transfer their belief onto a new model. Simply wishing away the state isn't going to work. Although it is something that's there to be wished away, in many senses. Aside from, of course, the army backing up the state, but that depends on the army believing in the state as well. So it's not wrong to think that thing could disappear. Why don't we have just this thing instead? But you have to bear in mind the amount of things that have to happen for that to take place. So I'm with you there. Yeah, I was certainly an anti-statist not that long ago. I think my first book is fairly anti-statist, but I think now that to realistically counter what we have, we need to somehow utilize the state. And it's interesting to what degree the role of the state has been has been changed anyway in recent years, and how much it is merely a support for capitalism when that wasn't really what it was supposed to be. And you talk about in the or it's not what it always has been, it shifts, but you talked about in the 1940s, during the war and after it, the role of the state, in the Second World War, and how we have a similar situation now with COVID. And you say that like World War II, you I think what you're saying is that you wouldn't expect that role to be extended long into peacetime or long into the post-COVID period. But I've just kind of like kind of shimmied from one subject to another, but that did interest me. Did you, I mean, do you not see any positivity in the sense that, I mean, come on, the post-World War II state did, bring in a massive welfare pledge which lasted for decades. Do you not see that possibility now?
I do actually see that, and I think while I realize there's a lot of ambiguities in the manifesto, which I think owes to sort of the nascent state of any organization along the lines of what I'm attempting to summon forth, or to encourage. I mean, I think that the issue here really has to do with what I point out is like, again, against this democratic fetish, like if you look at something like, right, like America was in a very, very unstable place, in terms of popular uprisings, manifestations, the tremendous growth of sort of the far right and the far left, in that period, right, sort of 29 to 33, Roosevelt's elected in 33. Right, and it's in response to that that Roosevelt endeavors to adopt this fairly ambitious program. Now, that ambitious program, the New Deal, isn't properly realized due to sort of legislative constraints until World War II gives him sort of a free pass to spend as much as he wants, right? And that's very, very important to remember as well. But it's interesting, like in spite of all this instability, even in that climate, right, in which I would venture that the relative power of the state may have been greater. Even in that climate, there was a huge amount of pushback from the private sector. And Roosevelt used to complain, right? He said, look, I'm trying to protect people with giant ranches, by building this new political settlement, and they detest me every step of the way and oppose me and call me a red, and this kind of thing. I think the question that we have to ask today, so I'm appreciative of those changes, and I don't like to be too reductive. I've been having this argument online with sort of more classical Marxist-Leninists who are maybe criticizing me and saying, well, you have a bourgeois state or a proletarian state. And what I actually think is that, and something that, neither Lenin nor certainly Marx lived long enough to see, is that in the 20th century has produced all kinds of weird hybrid forms. Maybe Marx was closest to that, in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, when he talks about the Bonapartism and the sort of weird synthesis that was occurred in the Third Empire in France. But in the 20th century, you go to these weird hybrid forms, right? I think fascism is one such form. And I think Schmitt, by the way, has a wonderful, explanation in a sense of fascism when he says, like, the era of individual rights was entirely appropriate to a society of like atomized laborers, but like the mass organization of the working class has made it impossible to maintain, this preservation of individual rights, which is sort of his justification of fascism. But very, very telling, I think, that sort of line. But obviously, I think if we look at the United States in the mid-century era, I mean, if we're talking about a place where there's massive amounts of public ownership, 92% top income tax rates, unions actively involved in the organization of political society and all of this, I mean, I think that's something quite different, than the sort of notional classical bourgeois state, which presaged it. Obviously today, if we look at a place like China, there's a ton of contradictions, and that's why it stimulates so much debate, right? And I think that's something we sometimes lose sight of, when we're talking about China, is that if there weren't this basic ambiguity, we wouldn't have all these discussions in the left, right? About the emancipatory or non-emancipatory character of certain Chinese structures. So we've had all these kind of mishmashes. Look, like, it's like if we were able to overturn neoliberalism and create something like the mid-century post-war settlement, whatever reservations I might have about that, and there are a lot, I think it would obviously be an improvement upon what we actually have in a lot of ways. At the same time, though, what I want to ask, and what I think is very fundamental, is the sort of legislative apparatus, is it actually capable of exercising that kind of control over capital today? Right? And I think, what we see is, like, in spite of all these public frustrations, in spite of the avowed best intentions of policymakers, and I do believe some of them, there's just a real incapacity to reverse, deepening wealth inequality. I mean, China's the only part of the world right now where wealth inequality is getting better, not worse. It's the only major economic part of the world. It's also the only major economic part of the world where, whatever its capitulation to capitalism, the state has preserved a high degree of autonomy vis-a-vis capital, right? So, is it the case that, in other words, this is to say, is it, if we were to conclude that Western states may not have the power, right, legislatively to actually change that, if we were to conclude that even if people were to, rise up and as they have actually in the last few years, kind of rise up and make some noise, that there's not going to be receptivity to that or sensitivity to that by legislators, right, who are, deeply beholden to lobbies, right, in this neoliberal dispensation. At that point, do we have to say, well, we need something more, right? And I think, I'm not issuing a definitive verdict on that, but I think it's a very important question to have.
Yeah, I guess it's going to come down to how much governments are convinced that people want change. I mean, at the moment, I think that it's very easy to co-opt the far right or the populist right, to co-opt it or to believe it's anyhow kind of appended to neoliberalism. The problem is that so many people who see capitalism as a problem or identify a definite kind of hierarchical issue going on with society end up joining mask movements and things. And this is something we really have to counter. But unfortunately, the left isn't making a case that's convincing people. Many working class people are identifying completely communist issues, are identifying frameworks that are leftist and problems that are, capitalist problems of capitalism, but then drifting to the right. And it's something that obviously happened also in the 1920s and 30s. It's how we sell ourselves, which is the issue, and I think it's a very big topic, which obviously we can't get into now. I think we need to wrap up shortly. Yeah. We can maybe talk another time and have Conrad back and talk about that. But I have a question. I know that you are giving a course with the New Center, which is an online school in which you can enroll for individual seminars. And kind of a wider kind of almost master's-like course, a course that kind of maps onto the master's degree system. And yes, you're doing this, and you do have to pay a little bit of money to study at the New Center, but I know the courses are around $200. I know that a one-credit course like this costs around €2,000 minimum in the $2,000 in the American university system. So you're teaching this course. I'm actually going to flash up my course there. I'm teaching a course around acid communism and art in January. Conrad is teaching one in February called The Meaning of the Subject. Do you want to just quickly give a little plug for that course?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think it's been very ubiquitous within the context of post-structuralism to speak about the death of the subject. Lyotard, for example, discusses the death of sort of the working subject of Marxism, Foucault and Barthes and people like this. And what I want to explore in the course is, and I think actually it was Jean-Luc Nancy, if I'm not mistaken, who in a conference with Etienne Balibar, he kind of said look, we have the death of the subject. He's like, but no one knows what came before the subject. I mean, there's no sort of historical mapping of that, right? It's there's the subject, okay, Kant, Descartes, whatever, and then the subject dies, right? But there's not a larger historical and social mapping of that. So what I'd like to kind of get into is, and I think it's not a coincidence if you see it through this prism that there's been a real, I think, persistence of the subject, right, as a sort of philosophical motif in recent years. What I want to get into is, where does the subject as we know it come from, right? And this is quite a complex subject, but I'm broadly beholden to Son Rethel's hypothesis, according to which the way subjectivity is interpreted by Kant, for example, right, when he sort of conflates physical space with the conceptual space of Euclidean geometry, when he discusses the transcendental aesthetic and things like this, is a consequence of the history of commodity producing society. And actually that's very interesting, right? Because Heidegger at some point he says look, he's the origin of the subject is in the Greek hypokemenon, right? It's like substratum, something which didn't refer to something like a person, right? That's only much later, really, with Descartes, that you begin to get the identification of the subject with the person in the way that or the observer, right? in the way we construe it in philosophy today. But this idea of the substratum, for example, also emerges in ancient Greece simultaneously with the exchange of commodities and the issuing of money, right? Or with commodity exchange having reached a point where it justifies the issuance of money. So it's the thesis of Son Rethel, for example, that it's actually value, right? This sort of perceived substance which unifies, right? Different commodities, which generates sort of the template upon which conceptions of the substratum are based, right? So I want to and in an obvious way, a lot of our discourses touch on this in different ways, right? I think it's very clear, for example, that there exists a relationship between the performance of wage labor, disproportionately by men, if we're talking about a lot of capitalist history, and the sort of objectification, as it were, of women within either philosophical discourses or general political society. So I'd like to, it's very complex to condense, but yeah, essentially I'd like to look at the relationship between the category of the subject and economic history, going as far back as ancient Greece in the course.
Well, that sounds a fascinating course, and there are also courses running from Reza Negrestani and Ray Bresse, among others, this semester. And it's actually this semester that carries on. I think it's a long semester, carries on into early next year. So yeah, check that out. Conrad's course and also my course there. Other than that, great to have you here, Conrad. I hope we can speak again soon. We've had reason to speak lately, but we haven't managed to speak for a long time. Yes, great. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everyone in the chat. We have a Patreon, so you can look at that. We have a whole lot of kind of private stuff there you can delve into if you pay as little as, I don't know, around $3 a month. And we're just going to play you out with a little advert.
Real fast, I wanted to mention to everyone what's coming up for us. We'll be having our discussion, our reading group that is going over The Aesthetic Dimension by Herbert Marcuse. And then after that, we'll be starting the new Zizek book, which I actually think will tie in very well with this conversation. And that's Disorder in Heaven, where I think my understanding is it's almost like the third pandemic book, and he's going to be arguing for a sort of war communism response to everything that's going on. So I think that will fit in very nicely with this conversation.
Our reading groups will be here and gone.
I just want to add quickly that about the war communism thing. So, the way that Lenin sort of used wartime practices, food rationing, the ubiquity of the state in public affairs to provide a template for the transition that he was trying to achieve. Actually, I think I should have an editorial coming out with Morningstar that in a more schematic and concise fashion is going to deal with some of the themes of the manifesto in relation to Lenin. But actually, I explicitly make that same link as well, which I think has been made by Andreas Malm. So I think that's actually kind of a meme on the left right now. But I just want to say Zizek was an influence in the manifesto too, like his article where he says that why are Greta and Bernie not so visible in this moment after the pandemic? It's because they weren't sort of radical enough, right? So I was really thinking about that too.
Okay, thank you for that last point. So we're going to quickly play you out with an advert for our Patreon, and hope to see you all soon.
Thanks so much.
If you have been enjoying our content, please consider registering your desire with the algorithm by liking and subscribing. This really does help us grow and reach a wider community. If you would like to support our work of documenting and nurturing the rise of post-capitalist desires, become a patron. This allows us to continue research-based memes, podcasts, and videos, as well as up our production value. Patrons receive early views of videos, exclusive content, and more, including physical art and the ability to directly influence our research topics. The building of a better world happens on many fronts. Turn on, tune in, and shape a future collective reality.